One of gaming's overall strongest and most reliable series is the Uncharted series. With 4.5 mainline AAA entries, this series has grown and developed over the course of 2 console generations to become one of the most iconic and respectable series in the medium. I myself have a very strong connection to the series, as I remember the first entry as fondly being my first adult video game. Although, after playing LEGO Star Wars for my first video game, I don't think there was ever anywhere else to go but down. My 7-year-old self was blown away by Nathan and his adventure in the deep jungle. Ever since, I've played every game as soon as I could, and I remember the series as being one of gaming's greatest. So why make this video now? A new Uncharted game seems almost impossible, and a movie is somewhat vague in the distance. These games give me my first experience with a medium that grows more every day, and I hope to demonstrate that these games deserve to be remembered. I plan to have a basic overview of each mainline game, including Lost Legacy. Golden Abyss will not be discussed, as I have no way to play that game. Lastly, in this semi-prologue, this analysis will only focus on the single-player components of these games. The honor among Thieves and Drake's Deception online servers went offline, and I only do wish to revisit the single-player aspects of these games and how well they still hold up. Due to the nature of discussing 5 games in their entirety, this could be a long video. In the description will be timestamps for my analysis on each game, so that you can watch it in parts or as one whole work, like how God intended. I will be spoiling each game, so keep that in mind if you haven't yet played through the series. I highly recommend playing through it before watching this video, but it's not required. So let's start off at the best place to start, the beginning. One of the earliest titles for the PlayStation 3, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, was released on November 20th, 2007, almost a year to the day after the PlayStation 3's launch. Uncharted 1 was received warmly, with an 88% on Metacritic and selling just under 5 million lifetime units. Nowadays, 12 years after launch, this game in its original state is definitely starting to feel the strain of age. While still incredibly good looking for a game that was released in 2007, just from a glance you can tell that this is definitely from 2 console generations ago. However, looking at WWE 2K20 and its Xbox 360 looking graphics, it's kinda hard to tell. Let's actually discuss the game now. Story-wise, Uncharted Drake's Fortune follows Nathan Drake and Victor Sullivan as they hunt for El Dorado, the lost city of gold, and reporter Elena Fisher gets caught up in their adventure. Over the course of the game, the trio discovers that in actuality, El Dorado is an idol that converts all near it into monsters, changing all the original inhabitants on the island into weird bony monsters that are called descendants. While the story is there, providing a framework for your adventure and a reason on paper to continue, the best part of this game is certainly not the story. The most enjoyable aspect of the game is how the main characters interact with the other characters, with their witty banter and one-liners. Each of the main characters exude charisma and charm, brimming with clever jokes about who they're with. Sully and Nate joke with each other in ways so that the audience can tell that they've been friends for years, and Elena's banter back with Nate is incredibly entertaining to watch. The villains, however, while threatening, are underwritten when compared to the central characters. 3 main villains, but even after playing, I can only remember the name of Eddie Raja off the top of my head. The other 2 villains are Gabriel Roman and Atak Navarro, who is the final boss to beat for the game. But when addressing this game, it is completely necessary to bring up the set-piece moments. In order to fully portray the feeling of an action movie, multiple elaborate set pieces were implemented into the game. Discovering a Nazi U-boat in the middle of the jungle, shooting enemies with a turret on the back of a jeep in a surprisingly good turret section, and multiple sections on the back of a jet ski. These set pieces break up the main gameplay to provide moments of levity, which allows the player to rest before going back to the gameplay. And being the first in these series, these set pieces are definitely nowhere near the quality of the later entry set pieces. That said, for a first entry, these set pieces are pretty good for a first attempt in 2007, and just the imagery of a U-boat beached in the middle of a jungle has practically become synonymous with the game. An observant viewer may have noticed I've spent all this time discussing the game and its framework, yet I've neglected to actually mention any gameplay. There's a reason for that. In the least amount of words possible, it's rough. Allow me to explain. I'm not the world's best video game player. Even though I've spent years playing video games and hundreds of hours in my life, I am definitely not part of the get good subculture. Most times I play my games on the normal difficulty in order to experience the game as much in the way that the developers intend for a mass audience. All this is background to say that when I played this game on normal, it was really difficult. I would regularly die to enemies multiple times in any combat encounters. The controls aren't all that precise. The enemies are just about tanks. These skinny dudes take 6 to 7 bullets from a rifle before dropping, and I swear to God that annoying weave that they do when you fire at them is seared into my corneas. For example, in the late game, you go back through a church that you've already explored, and there are snipers present and ground enemies, all coming to flank you. If you attempt to pick off the ground enemies first, the snipers get you. If you take too long eliminating the snipers, who are a good distance away, then the ground enemies can flake you and kill you. I must have retried this section more than 10 times before I actually found the lucky way to pass this section. It isn't necessarily that I dislike that the game is difficult, it's just that when I beat the section I was stuck on, I don't feel that I've mastered this section. I would feel that I just finally found the best way to get through it while taking as little damage as possible. When actually playing though, the actual guns and aiming are a little too loose as well. That's the best way to describe it without having played it. You slip over the enemy you're trying to fire at while they dodge your bullets like a superhuman. So with bullet sponge enemies that just absorb way more than humanly possible to the point of absurdity, and combat encounters that absolutely become a tedious slog, the actual combat encounters are nothing special in 2021. These combat sections are broken up by the classic Uncharted climbing and maneuvering. Climbing up walls, and then climbing up walls, and then climbing up a ladder, and then climbing up more walls in order to foster that sense of exploration found in action movies. It's also passable. It does what it needs to in order to advance to the next section. But there are times when the camera doesn't play along when switching out of a cutscene. After the cutscene where Nate believes Sully is shot, the player immediately upon return to the game is running away. Playing again, I ran straight off a cliff because the camera was in a place that I was not familiar with, so I was unfamiliar with how Nate would move. It's little things like that, which take the game from good to passable. Both elements are drastically refined and improved in later entries, but when judging Drake's Fortune's gameplay on its own merits, it's pretty frustrating. So what does this mean my opinion is on Drake's Fortune? For a first entry, especially when it was released, it was certainly an impressive game in the visual department, and in the writing department. However, in the gameplay department, it falters and becomes a slog to finish on the PlayStation 3. While I loved listening to the characters talk to each other, it was so frustrating playing through it again that I almost walked away from this project entirely, but I kept with it. While it may sound like I despise the game, overall, I think that the story and writing is of such high quality that the game is absolutely worth playing. While the game may become challenging, I would absolutely suggest sticking with it, as this game is the beginning of the narrative for a narratively rich series, and is probably the best played in 2021 through the Nathan Drake collection. The highly anticipated sequel to Drake's Fortune, Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, was released on October 13th, 2009, just under 2 years after the original game was released. Uncharted 2 improved on every aspect from the first and is recognized as one of the greatest games on the PlayStation 3, and one of the best games of all time, with a 96% on Metacritic and receiving almost 200 Game of the Year awards. Selling 6.74 million lifetime copies, the game sold almost 2 million more units than its predecessor. Everything from the visuals, to the gameplay, to the story are all improved, with the addition of a new multiplayer mode onto the fantastic single-player experience. This game solidified Naughty Dog as a force to be reckoned with during the 7th console generation, as they were able to top the ideas present in the original game, with only 22 months of production. With such a strong introduction to the game, let's see how Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, holds up in 2021. In the second entry, the story follows Nate on a new adventure, looking for the mythical city of Shambhala. Nathan begins the city by waking up on a train and quickly discovers that the train is hanging off a cliff. And so, for your first mission in the game, you're immediately thrust into an amazing action set piece. As you climb your ways up this wayward train, it keeps slipping further and further off the mountain, so that the player feels that they're about to slide off too. Making it to the top, Nate jumps off the train onto solid ground as the train plummets into the cavern below. The game then takes us forward an undisclosed amount of time so that the player can discover how exactly Nate came to be on a sideways train. After that attention-grabbing introduction, this game takes Nate all over the world. In this entry, the story is much, much better. While the first game was isolated in its own jungle island, Uncharted 2 has many more varied locations. The writing is also just as good as the first game, but the actual story itself is impeccable too. Whereas the last game's story was just a vague narrative thread in order to have gameplay moments, Uncharted 2 creates an effective story for its characters. With the additions of Harry Flynn, Chloe Frazer, and Zoran Lazarevic, Uncharted 2 has a gripping, dramatic story. Harry Flynn is a fantastic side villain who acts perfectly as a foil to Nate. In literature, a foil character is a character who is intended to contrast with the main character in order to demonstrate the main character's traits even more. Harry Flynn is exactly what Nate would be without his morals, a sly treasure hunter who is only after the treasure for the money. At the same time, Chloe Fraser is also a foil to both Elena and Nate. Chloe is a foil to Elena because while Elena can definitely be seen as innocent, Chloe is never afraid to get her hands dirty and do what needs to be done. She trades sides to save her skin, she wants to leave a wounded man behind, and she is a perfect representation of if Elena cared about those around her less. Chloe also foils Nate in the same way, as Nate's moral compass is about the same as Elena's, in that they both wouldn't leave anyone behind. All this literary talk and mention of literary devices is mainly to bring up that even conceptually, these characters were created to play off each other. The player can perfectly feel the tension when Chloe and Elena first meet each other, and that is only one example of how the character interactions in this game are some of the best in gaming. But in order to get these extremely different characters to work together for a common purpose, they would need a strong antagonist. And that's exactly what Lazarevich brings to the table. Lazarevich is cold, calculating, and not at all hesitant to sacrifice his own men for his own gain. This game is decisively more dramatic stakes. If Lazarevich gets to Shambhala first, he will be able to take over the entire world. In comparison, while the first game still has stakes, seeing how brutal Lazarevich is firsthand absolutely shows the character that there is a reason for playing, not only just for the sake of discovery, but also because the fate of the world hangs in the balance. Not only is the story much stronger than the original game, but the set pieces are exponentially better as well. Beginning with a high note by having to scale a train, the game continues to give amazing set pieces, as there is a helicopter chase scene, having to take out other jeeps from the back of a truck, being chased by an actual tank in a small Tibetan village, and just watching as the tank destroys this tiny village, and even going back to having to go to the front of the moving train, knowing full well where this train is going to end up. Every set piece is better and more explosive than the last, and absolutely feels like you're playing the latest action movie. In present day, these moments are still as stunning as they were in 2011 and definitely shows off the power of the PlayStation 3. How does the sequel feel to play though? I can say that the combat is considerably better than the last game with what seems to be multiple refinements to what was already there. These refinements lead to enemies not feeling so punishing on normal mode, less lengthy combat sections, and changes to the enemy's AI so that they behave better than they did in the last game. Guns feel smoother, aiming feels better, and the combat is much less of a slog to get through. In the best way to explain it, combat sections are less lengthy and more sporadic than the first game, so it doesn't feel like every corner you go to is a whole new gunfight. The pacing is much better in that regard, with a healthy subset of climbing and puzzles to balance out the experience. Nothing outstays its welcome, and every experience seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. When I was doing a longer puzzle and I would wish for a new combat encounter, almost immediately the puzzle finished and new bad guys appeared. When I started becoming fatigued by battle, there would be a climbing section or a puzzle to solve. Just the experience of playing is heightened over the last one, and I greatly enjoyed playing through this one again. The best compliment I can give the gameplay is that it never inhibited my want to play this game like the first one did. In this game, the story got me hooked, the gameplay served the story almost as perfectly as possible. Not nearly as frustrating, more balanced gunfighting and more climbing and puzzle sections led to the gameplay being much better than the original. On a personal note, I really enjoyed the ending conversation between Elena and Nate, which perfectly encapsulates the chemistry between the two of them and shows just why I wanted to play through this series again. Just watch.
So where do we go from here, huh?
I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead.
Of course not. But then again, neither have I.
Good.
So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how scared were you that I was gonna die?
4.
4?
Yeah, why?
A 4.
Yeah.
You were at least an 8.
An 8?
You were a total 8.
An 8? Those guardian things were an 8.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, those were terrifying.
What's a 10?
Clowns?
Clowns over my death?
I hate
Clowns?
clowns. I hate clowns.
Oh my word. You thought I was dead.
No.
No, you thought I was gone.
No,
Yes,
no.
you did.
No, I
saw
had you
you
all
shed
along.
tears. You shed a bunch of them.
Tears?
Mhm.
It was raining.
No, it was not.
You were unconscious and it was
It
raining.
was totally sunny out and you were bawling.
It wasn't sunny. You were unconscious.
Whatever. I kept your tears in a jar. I have proof.
I'll give you 5. How's that?
I love that exchange, and it just left me smiling. When thinking about this game, I absolutely agree that this is an amazing game. Even now, most developers don't devote as much time to their characters as Naughty Dog did in 2007, and while the gameplay is nothing earth-shattering, the story has aged like fine wine. Absolutely play this if you haven't, and maybe it's time to revisit this game for all of us who have played it before. An amazing experience from top to bottom, Uncharted 2: Drake's Fortune is an amazing sequel, and truly a highlight of gaming and this series. The follow-up to one of the greatest games of all time, Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception, released to PlayStation 3 consoles on November 1st, 2011. The game received a 92% on Metacritic and sold 6.84 million lifetime units. Coming after Among Thieves, Drake's Deception was regarded as good, but not as great as Among Thieves. While still garnering praise and attention, Among Thieves had a more positive reception from fans than Drake's Deception did. Drake's Deception increased the graphic fidelity and storytelling ability farther than the two previous titles, being the last Uncharted on the PlayStation 3, with developer Naughty Dog pushing massive amounts of power through the system so that it looked as gorgeous as possible. Even though it's regarded as one of the weaker entries, let's dive into the third entry of the Uncharted series. Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception follows Nathan and Sully and a whole new cast of characters as they hunt for the fabled Pillars of Aram. Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception follows Nathan and Sully and a whole new cast of characters as they hunt for the fabled Aram of the Pillars, a lost city in the desert. This adventure is a whole new experience that the normal gang is looking for, and also goes into detail on Nate and Sully's relationship and their backstory. The story starts in London, with Nathan and Sullivan going to meet Talbot, who is interested in buying an artifact that the two have acquired. A brawl ensues over counterfeit money, and one of Talbot's crew shoots Nate and Sully dead in an alley, in the first several minutes of the game. This crew member turns out to be Nate's newest addition to the crew, Charlie Cutter. Cutter's help in the staged death of Nate and Sully allow the group to go in and steal the next critical step in their journey from the new antagonist, Catherine Marlowe. With Uncharted 1, I spent a fair amount of time describing Chloe and Lazarevich, but there just isn't as much to talk about with these characters. Cutter is probably the most interesting of the additions, given that he is also a strong protagonist. However, the voice actor was signed on to work for The Hobbit, so he was written out of the story fairly early on with Chloe, so neither appear after the halfway point of the game. Cutter was actually a really good addition to Nate's crew. I really enjoyed him, as he was quite funny and especially helpful for Nate to talk to another scholarly person. It was a shame that he was drafted out of the script so early. Next to cover is Marlowe. Marlowe is probably the least interesting antagonist of the game, and I still don't remember the names of the antagonists from the first game. Marlowe has the interesting distinction of the audience being able to see her history with Sully and Nate from early on, being an old girlfriend of Sully's, but on her own merits, Marlowe is just not very intimidating. I find the Uncharted protagonists to be the best when they are intimidated, and the writers attempted to have Marlowe be intimidating in a mob boss type of way. A mob boss sits in a chair and demands others to do their work. You know they're intimidating because not even the biggest guys in the room will disobey them. Marlowe is just unable to pull that off. Rather, I feel that she is not able to bring enough to the table to be intimidating. With a mob boss, if you don't do what they say, you're liable to end up sleeping with the fishes. With Marlowe, I just do not feel the intimidation factor, or why I should feel threatened by her. But I may be in the minority on this. The last new character to touch on is Talbot. Talbot is interesting because in both the earlier games, the series has never shied away from magic or the spectacular. Rather, both games have leaned into that mystical factor, with the magic taking center stage around the third act of the game. Talbot does multiple weird things in the game, such as hypnotizing Cutter so that Cutter wants to attack Nate, and taking a bullet, but in the very next scene, showing no ill effects after said bullet. It doesn't bother me that this content is in Uncharted. Uncharted has been wacky from the beginning. The only thing that bothers me, though, is that it's never explained how Talbot is able to achieve the magical feats that he accomplishes in this game, or even brought up again. They just do it, and then it just moves on. Probably the two highlights of the narrative in this game are what we get to see how Nate and Sully meet each other, and then we also get to see a dramatic conclusion. On the first highlight, we are treated to multiple sections where we play as a young Nathan Drake, and it is here that we see Nate's first flirts with adventure and stealing, his first encounter with Sully, and how Marlowe has essentially been an antagonist from the very beginning of Nate's story. Seeing Nate's first encounter with Sully is incredibly cool from a player's perspective because before this, we had never actually seen any backstory before. Everything was hinted at, but nothing was directly shown. Now with this backstory having been the first piece directly fleshing out this universe, it becomes some of the best moments in this game. Now, onto the second highlight, the dramatic ending is one of my highlights for the entire series. I really enjoy the emotional response from Nathan when he believes that Sully was killed. The writers did a fantastic job in ensuring the audience also believes that Sully is killed, and the revelation of Sully not having been killed is artfully revealed as well as not being done distastefully. The emotion is genuine when Nate encounters and embraces Sully again after seeing his death. However, the reason that Uncharted 3 is probably best remembered is for the gameplay experiences. Probably the most well-known experience from this game was when Nathan had to stay aboard a plane as it crash lands, and it is one of the most fun segments from these 3 early games. This game also experiments with multiple locations, like the second game, and even more varied than the previous game. It starts in London, the player moves over underground, then to a French castle, then to a giant boat section, and a desert temple. Overall, though, I think the game spends too long on the boat section of the gameplay, but it was pretty cool seeing water implemented with a gameplay mechanic. This game was good, I just feel that it wasn't as noteworthy or groundbreaking as the other entries. The writers and designers definitely attempted to further expand the gameplay mechanics as well as the locations, but I do not think they were able to capture the Uncharted 2 style lightning in a bottle. The pieces are there, this game does not put the pieces together in the most effective way in order to be considered as good as the second game, but is much better overall than the first game. The combat is still fine, but there are minor improvements here, and this is a fairly decent experience. If I had to define this game into a phrase, Uncharted 3 would be the unexceptional middle child. This game doesn't do enough to stand out from the others, but it is definitely not so bad as to stand out in that regard either. Uncharted 4 was the first new Uncharted game built for the PlayStation 4, and the new hardware combined with more development time pays off for the game. Released May 10th, 2016, Uncharted 4 A Thief's End sold 10.33 million lifetime sales, more than any of the other titles, with a Metacritic score of 93%. A Thief's End introduced more open environments, allowing more freedom of movement and exploration from the player, as well as refined combat, which is mechanically better than any previous game. Narratively, Uncharted 4 is a high note in this series, with Sam becoming one of my favorite characters introduced across all the games. As a result, Uncharted 4 is not only graphically impressive, but it probably contains the best narrative in the series. With that said, let's discuss Nathan Drake's final video game. This game begins strong, with Nathan and Sam on a boat, speeding away from mercenaries who are shooting at you and your boat. Acting as a gameplay tutorial, the first minutes of the game draw the player in as it kicks off with a bang. Immediately, firefight on open water, with rain storming around your vessel. Uncharted 4 is the most complex game to talk about, as it is the game with the grandest scale in the series. From dedicated stealth mechanics, to a more open environment, to a grappling hook, it seems Naughty Dog sought to innovate on every single core idea of the franchise. Where there were gunfights before, now they take place across multiple stories, on boats, and on pirate vessels. Every aspect of Uncharted was innovated on, and that demonstrates why Naughty Dog is revered as one of the top game developers. The story here is just as non-chronological as the third game, with even more trips into Nate's childhood than before. If you thought Uncharted 3 expanded the universe, Uncharted 4 beats that by a long shot. The first hour is spent in the past, fleshing out Nate's backstory. This is mainly done so that the player can have some connection to Samuel Drake, Nate's long-lost brother. We knew from the third game that Nate was an orphan, so that the writers over at Naughty Dog had to devise a way so that the players could not only enjoy Sam as a character, but not wonder why he wasn't a part of the adventure or even mentioned in any game prior. This could have been accomplished incredibly poorly and resulted in a much less cohesive and enjoyable game. But not only does the addition of Sam to the game show how capable the writers over at Naughty Dog are, it also shows the quality of writers that they employ. Now, onto a basic overview. Sam and Nate were orphans, whose mother died when they were young, and their father gave up custody of them. So, they were forced into a Catholic orphanage, where the game starts out. After that, we flash forward to Nate and Sam in a Panamanian jail, and we find out that they paid to be there so that they could gain access to the next clue in finding the treasure of Henry Avery, who had stolen $400 million in gold in the 1695 Gunsway heist. However, during the prison escape, Sam is shot and Nate is forced to leave him behind, presumably for dead. We flash forward to Nate in the current day, having retired from being a treasure hunter and working a more blue-collar job scavenging modern-day accidents. Sam reveals himself to Nate and tells Nate how he had survived the jail, had promised the gold for Hector Alcazar, a drug lord, and if Sam failed to get the money, Alcazar would have Sam killed. Nate agrees to help Sam find Henry Avery's treasure, and without telling his wife Elena, Nate heads off with Sam to find the lost treasure. Uncharted 4 takes a more serious approach with the story than previous games, with more grounded stakes and character motivations than any previous game. In my opinion, this leaves the game feeling much more relatable. Nate travels around the world from Italy to Scotland to Madagascar to several islands surrounding Madagascar where most of the game takes place. I've discussed Sam some, but I think I'll finish up my thoughts on him here. Overall, I believe that his surprise addition was handled as well as it possibly could have been, given that it was, in fact, a surprise introduction. Regardless, Troy Baker is a wonderful actor, and Sam served the story quite well. Two other new characters are antagonists Rafe Adler and Nadine Ross. Starting with Rafe, I love that he actually used to be on the same side with Sam and Nate. I love the connection that they were all on the same side, but Rafe's admiration turned to obsession and lost the Drake brothers. Rafe is well acted and a strong antagonist to Nate and Sam. Rafe has no morals and is the poster child for spoiled rotten. His jealousy of Nate is central to his character, and I enjoy that for an antagonist. The ultimate sword battle with him does a great job as a climactic conclusion to their rivalry, and I think Rafe is probably the most relatable villain in the series. Always just being in second place made him turn into a vengeful, obsessed monster, and the finale ends with his demise. The other antagonist is Nadine Ross, and I use the term antagonist in the strict sense of the word. While Rafe is more of a villain, Nadine is what is in between our main character and the goal. She works with Rafe because he hired out her company, but you never see the two of them working well together. Nadine is by the books, while Rafe always seems to act based on his intuition. They never rub each other the right way, which all comes to a boil at the end, where Rafe turns Nadine's men against her, and he forces her to board Captain Avery's ship while she said how she was against boarding it. Nadine is a good foil to Rafe, as she only amplifies the irrationality of his actions. If he had only stopped to listen to the help that he had hired to help him, he may have very well won, but because he wouldn't listen to her, he ends up dead at the end of the game. I think that these new characters are both great additions to the series. Going back to the story, this narrative is one of my favorites because of how much the writers liked to utilize shades of gray. For example, in Uncharted 2, Lazarevich is a war criminal who kills because people have minorly inconvenienced him. Nate is most certainly the good guy in this story, and Lazarevich is definitely the bad guy. That's black and white. However, while Nate is still the protagonist, he doesn't tell his wife that he is leaving and creates friction with her, and sometimes does the irrational thing. While it seems to only be for the story that he doesn't tell Elena, which is annoying, Nate's failure to tell her just strikes me as an attempt to have Nate be an imperfect person, which we all are. All the central characters are flawed, and that makes this game much more interesting to discuss than the previous entries. Sam's double-crossing of Nate and Nate's lying to Elena demonstrates to me that neither protagonist is perfect, which is an aspect that I enjoy being explored. However, I feel that both of these problems were resolved too quickly. Nate having lied to Elena over the course of months is resolved in just a few hours, and Nate walks away unaffected. Making a flawed character is only more frustrating if that flawed character does not receive consequences for his mistakes, and Nate has no consequences for his mistakes besides an argument. If I could change one thing, I would wish that Nate felt the consequences of his decisions more than he did, so he emerged changed, instead of just becoming a bullet point on the plot summary page. With the two both being separate tones of gray was highly enjoyable and just led me to become even more invested in the story. To summarize my thoughts on the narrative of Uncharted 4, I think that it is probably one of the strongest of the series, but with the direction change to a more serious tone, more good than bad arises, and Uncharted 4's story stands as a definitive high point for the series and acts as a fitting crescendo to Nate's arc. Now to move on to the gameplay. As said before, every single aspect of the gameplay had a fine comb run through it to figure out what worked and what didn't work. Gunfights are now even tighter than before, and are even bigger than any of the prior games, meaning traversal while fighting is an option. In sections, players can attack groups of enemies outright, attempt to take the stealthy approach, and even lose enemies once having been spotted. The traversal has been improved too, with easier to find edges and also no movement problems from transitioning like the earlier games. The grappling hook is a fantastic addition, and is incredibly satisfying to use at all times. Another aspect of the gameplay that is unique to the series is open-ended vehicle segments, where the player has to maneuver around an open space to get to the next objective. It's refreshing to feel the reins let loose more than they have ever been, and continues to show the care that Naughty Dog puts into their games. Two strong suits of the gameplay specifically is its pacing of action versus inaction, and its locations. Firstly, to bring back that comb analogy, even the pacing was combed to perfection. I was never bored of puzzle solving or tired of fighting. As soon as I began to get tired of one activity, the other activity took its place. It was incredibly refreshing, and almost strange at times how I would be ready for gunfighting, and then there would be a gunfight. Secondly, what I meant by location, and that this game truly feels as if by the time you leave that location, Nathan has turned over every stone and ransacked it entirely. I feel like a treasure hunter, and I had entirely explored an area from top to bottom. This small thing stood out to me after having come away from Uncharted 3, where I would leave a location thinking that there was still more to explore, like in the Syrian chapel, or like I had been there for way too long, like with the shipyard section. The gameplay is certainly the most refined out of any of the games by a long shot, and definitely feels like a next-gen video game, even 5 years later, and with a whole new console generation having arrived. Uncharted 4 is an amazing game that shows just how amazing Naughty Dog is, as both storytellers and as creators of gameplay experiences. While an absolutely amazing entry with heart, narrative depth, gameplay innovations by the tens, and graphical fidelity that melts eyeballs, I still have a soft spot overall for Uncharted 2. While Uncharted 4 is undoubtedly an amazing PlayStation game that pushes the PlayStation 4, Uncharted 2 is a charm that I can never forget, and re-experienced after my recent replay of the game. Uncharted 2's more narratively based story is a point for it, not against it, and I think that I have to rank the second game above the fourth game, no matter how much I enjoy this game. Uncharted 4 is an amazing gameplay experience. However, Naughty Dog had to improve upon a game considered to be one of the greatest of all time, and overall, Naughty Dog was just short of surpassing what Uncharted 2 had that made it so amazing in the first place. Released on August 22nd, 2017, Lost Legacy shifted the focus from Nathan to Chloe and Nadine, characters introduced in Uncharted 2 and 4 respectively. The game received an 84% on Metacritic, as well as selling only 2.37 million compared to the rest of the series. Following a hunch, Google Trends proved that Lost Legacy was barely talked about when put in comparison to the conversation of the whole series. The lack of discussion for this game surprised me, as the original price point would make me think that more people would give it a shot. However, the main thing to preface with is that Nate does not appear in this game whatsoever. Sam makes a surprise appearance about halfway through, spoilers like I said, and Nathan is mentioned but never seen. After spending 4 mainline entries with Nate, it's actually pretty cool to get to see these universe from other characters' perspectives. As I mentioned before, I just feel that it's important to state that this game is shorter than every other game in the series, and at release it was priced $20 lower, so I feel that it is something to bear in mind when discussing this game. So, let's get into my thoughts on the most recent Uncharted game. I have mixed opinions about Lost Legacy. To begin with what I enjoyed the gameplay, as that's almost unchanged from Uncharted 4. The only change that I was actually able to point out for myself was the addition of C4 as a grenade type to the single player. There is still the same climbing, driving, and shooting from the fourth game, just now with Chloe and Nadine as the two central characters, so I don't feel that there's all much to talk about when discussing how the game plays. What you play, rather, feels like an Uncharted series greatest hits collection. In order to show that this is a greatest hits collection, I will focus on the final train segment of the game. To begin with, just talking about a train sequence in an Uncharted game probably makes most fans think about the second game, as that game is synonymous with its use of trains throughout the game for set-piece moments. However, Lost Legacy's sequence is different enough so that it doesn't feel as though the player is doing something they've already done before. It feels as if it's a homage to that train sequence. Not playing as Nate allows the segment to stand by itself more, and the PlayStation 4 allowed the game developers to add vehicles pulling up to the train that you can jump on, allowing for much more freedom of movement than the original, and differentiating itself further from the material that it is paying homage to. So, what I mean to say is that the game feels as if it's one last hurrah for the Uncharted series, taking the player through events that they've already done before, but have just enough of a new coat of paint that the events don't feel stale. So, gameplay-wise, I really enjoyed this game. The story is where my opinions are a little less defined. I loved Chloe Fraser in this game, and Claudia Black, Chloe's actress, should be commended for her role. She was heartfelt and sincere and was able to carve out her own spot in the Uncharted universe. Filling Nate's shoes is no easy task, yet Claudia was able to ground the role in ways that Nate never was. She was witty and clever like Nate, but she was different enough so that I didn't feel like I was just playing a female version of him. But I'm not all that happy with Nadine's role in this game. Nadine feels incredibly wooden, and while her character is supposed to be a no-nonsense character, her portrayal still comes off as a little bit stilted in my opinion. Nadine feels whatever the writers need her to feel. Halfway through, Nadine discovers that Chloe hadn't told her about Sam Drake and is so upset with Chloe that she leaves Chloe behind, but then stops being angry right on the verge of character development. The only character that seemed to change as a result of the story was Chloe. In Uncharted 2, she was willing to leave a man behind to speed up her own exit. Here, at the end of the game, she risks her life preventing a bomb from reaching a city, which would have killed thousands. Nadine, however, didn't seem to change much at all. Granted, this is a spin-off game, and is priced lower. All that is being kept in mind. I just wish that Nadine could have grown more as a character in a believable, less stilted way from the way that was shown in the game. Sam Drake's appearance is enough to make fans of the series happy, adding yet another lighthearted character to the foray. The villain of this story, Asav, is actually quite a good performance. He demands the player's attention when he is on screen and is truly maniacal enough to be a great Uncharted villain. I really enjoyed fighting against him, and I enjoyed that Chloe used her final words to twist his own words back at him. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy actually feels lost to me, due to the lack of people that mention this game. This game seems to have flown entirely under the mainstream radar in my opinion, but that also makes sense. If Uncharted 4 was this series' swan song, then The Lost Legacy was the victory lap for Uncharted fans. One last time, doing all things Uncharted you know and love doing, for now at least. I enjoyed this game, and I think that most fans of the series at least enjoyed their time with this entry too. This is the conclusion. We've reached the end of the video. This is going to be way more off the cuff than the rest of it, because I just didn't really like what I had for the conclusion. I've been working on this writing for a long time. This has started all the way back in 2019, and it's just kind of been sitting on my hard drive until I found someone that was willing to edit. And at over 7,600 words, this is more than I've ever done for voiceover content. I'm really excited to see how it comes together in the final edit. I really wanted to do this because I loved these games and just wanted to see how they still hold up right now. But I hope this video was at least interesting. Make sure to leave feedback as to whether or not it was, or what I could change to make it any better. So thanks overall for watching. I hope you enjoyed my opinions on the Uncharted series, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks.